Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates. Hello everyone, welcome to our weekly series of the Indian Express Explained section. In this particular video discussion, we shall be focusing on the important articles that have appeared in the Indian Express Explained section for the 4th week of July 2021. Let us begin our today's discussion. Coming to the first article for today's analysis, the article is titled as The Curious Case of India's Falling Unemployment Rate in 2019-20. See, recently the National Statistical Office has published the third annual report of the Periodic Labour Force Survey. This report has captured the employment and unemployment rated statistics for the duration of July 2019 to June 2020. So broadly we can say that it has tried to capture the employment rated data for the financial year 2019-20. As you can see here, for the financial year 2019-20, the unemployment rate according to this particular report is 4.8%. See, when this report was published for the first time in the year 2017-18, that time the unemployment in case of India was at 45-year high of 6.1%. Later, it got reduced to 5.8% and now it has further got reduced to 4.8%. Now, this is considered to be little surprising. Why is it surprising? In particular, if you look at the financial year 2019-20, in this particular financial year, the Indian economy started registering the economic slowdown. In this particular financial year, the Indian economy registered the GDP growth rate of hardly around 4.2%. So ideally, when there was a slowdown in the economy, when there was a decrease in the GDP growth rate, then the unemployment rate should have increased rather than decreasing. But what does the latest PLFS report show? According to latest PLFS report, the unemployment rate has got reduced from 5.8 to 4.8. So this is a curious case. So this is what this article has tried to decode. So this article has tried to decode as to why the unemployment rate in the Indian economy has reduced in spite of the decrease in the GDP growth rate. See, if you have to understand this particular topic, you should first be well aware about various basic concepts. Concepts such as the terms related to employment, what are the different approaches to measure the unemployment in the Indian economy, the official labor survey reports, and so on. So the idea behind this particular discussion is to ensure that if at all in UPSC any question is asked related to employment or unemployment in the prelims, you should be in a position to attempt those questions. So while keeping this as a background to our discussion, we will comprehensively understand all the aspects related to employment from the perspective of the UPSC prelims examination. At the end of our discussion, you should be in a position to attend 5 prelims based questions for the practice. These questions have been shown on the screen. So let's start off our discussion with the first topic related to different terms related to employment. The first term is the labor force. See, labor force basically includes all those people who are either working or looking out for work. So there are two important things here. First thing is, it not only includes those people who are working, but it also includes the people who are looking out for work. That's the first thing. Secondly, see, when we say looking out for work, it means that we are excluding those people who may not be willing to work or who may not be looking out for work. Now take for instance, majority of the people in the age group 19 to 25, these people right now may be pursuing their higher education and hence they are not looking out for jobs. Accordingly, these people will not be considered to be part of our labor force. Further, let's take your own example. Most of you may have already completed your graduation, but right now you're not searching for jobs, but you're preparing for the UPSC Civil Service examination. Accordingly, you cannot be considered to be part of the labor force. So labor force includes those people who are either working or looking out for work. See, in the year 2018-19, the total population of India was approximately around 130 crores. Out of this 130 crore Indians, how many Indians do you think were part of labor force? 50, 60 or 70 crores? How many Indians were part of the labor force? In order to understand this, let's look at this particular screenshot from the economic survey. In particular, please focus on the last column here. As you can see, in the year 2018-19, out of 130 crore Indians, only 51 crore Indians were part of the labor force. Out of this 51 crore, 48 crore Indians were actually employed and the remaining 3 crore Indians were unable to find the jobs. So out of 130 crores, only 51 crores were part of the labor force. And if you convert this into percent, this would be approximately around 39%. So hardly like out of every 100 Indians, only 40 Indians are either working or looking out for work. Remaining 60 Indians, they may not be working or may not be looking out for work. Now this is quite lower in comparison to the global norm. The global norm here is approximately around 60%, whereas in case of India, it is hardly like 39%. Similarly, if you look at countries such as China, in China, this percent is as high as around 76%. Similarly, in Indonesia, it is as high as 69%, whereas in case of India, it is hardly 39%. See, these facts and figures with respect to what percent of our population is part of a labor force can be used by you while writing an answer in the UPSC mains examination. So this could be a point to highlight that India has failed to optimally utilize its human resources in order to promote the higher GDP growth rate. Nevertheless, coming back to the second point here, workforce. Workforce basically includes the people who are employed, and as we have seen, it is approximately around 48 crore Indians. Next is the unemployed. Unemployed here is the people who are looking out for work, but they may not be able to get the job. So in the year 2018-19, this was approximately around 3 crore Indians. Next is the labor force participation rate. See, labor force participation rate is basically the percentage of the population which is part of the labor force. See, if we have to calculate the labor force participation rate, we can calculate this either at all India level or we can calculate it at the level of the working age group. When we want to calculate the labor force participation rate at all India level, then we will calculate this in terms of the population of entire India. So if you look at the formula in this particular case, it will be labor force divided by the entire population of India into 100. As we have seen, the total population of India in the year 2018-19, this was approximately around 130 crores. The labor force was 51 crores. So here, if you apply the formula of 51 divided by 130 into 100, this would be approximately equal to 39%. So when we say 39%, it is in terms of the entire population of India. Another way of calculating the labor force participation rate is in terms of the working age population, which means in the denominator here, we will take into account only the working age group of greater than 15 years. So basically here we are excluding the children. Now, according to this particular formula, the labor force participation rate in case of India, this is approximately around 50%. So please do understand here, if you are calculating the labor force participation rate as part of the entire population of India, this will be like 39%. And if you are calculating the labor force participation rate as part of the working age population, this would be like around 50%. The next one is the worker population ratio. The worker population ratio, it is calculated as the workforce, that is the total number of people who are employed, divided by the total population into 100. So these are the basic terms related to employment. Now, in what way questions can be asked with respect to this particular terms? Let's look at this particular example. So here, look at the practice MCQ 1. It says as to which among the following factors can lead to increase in the labor force participation rate in India. The first one is increase in employment creation. Second one is increase in enrollment in the higher education. And the third one is increase in number of unemployed youths. So what do you think is the answer to this particular question? Please do let us know your answer in the comment section given below. Now coming to approaches to measure the employment status, that is, how do we measure the unemployment in India? In order to measure the unemployment, we normally carry out a survey. Initially, as part of a survey, we first choose the sample size. After we choose the sample size, then we choose certain categories of people. To these people, we normally ask questions with respect to their employment status. Based upon the response that we get, we come out with the results. These results are then extrapolated to find out the overall unemployment at an all India level. Now, with respect to nature of questions that we ask the people, there are basically two approaches. One is the user status approach and the other one is a current weekly status approach. In the user status approach, we normally ask a person as to whether a person was able to find a job for major part of the financial year. That means if I was able to find job for the previous 365 days, if he was majorly employed for the previous 365 days, then such a person would be considered as employed. Whereas under the current weekly status, we ask this question to a person as to whether a person was able to find job for at least 1 hour during the previous 7 days. And if the person says yes, then such a person would be considered as employed person. So as you can see, under the user status approach, the reference period is previous 365 days. Whereas under the current weekly status, the reference period is previous 7 days. So obviously, since the reference period is different, the kind of results that we get from these two approaches will also be different. See, usually when we measure the extent of unemployment by using the user status approach, this will be lower in comparison to the unemployment that we measure according to the current weekly status approach. This is so because the probability of a person getting a job in the previous 365 days, this is obviously higher or more than the probability of a person getting a job in the previous 7 days. So usually the unemployment that we get according to the user status approach, that will be lower in comparison to the unemployment that we get according to the current weekly status approach. Now, when the PLFS has come out with a report for the extent of unemployment in its third annual report, according to the user status approach, the unemployment is actually 4.8%. But if you look at the current weekly status approach, according to this approach, the unemployment is still higher at 8.8%. So here, according to user status approach, the extent of unemployment has got reduced from 5.8 to 4.8%. But according to current weekly status approach, the unemployment has remained at 8.8%, which is similar to its value in the previous financial year. So one of the main reasons as to why the unemployment has come down in India is because of the fact that when we are looking at unemployment, we are looking at it in terms of the user status approach and not in terms of the current weekly status approach. If we actually measure the unemployment in terms of the current weekly status approach, the level of unemployment has actually remained the same. Now coming to a list of the official labor survey report, the most important report happens to be the periodic labor force survey report, which is published by the National Statistical Office. See, earlier the National Statistical Office used to publish a report known as the Employment and Unemployment Survey. This report was published at a frequency of every 5 years. So there was a need to publish a report related to employment and unemployment at a much lower frequency. That is why the National Statistical Office decided to replace the earlier reports with the Periodic Labor Force Survey report. The Periodic Labor Force Survey report is published on a quarterly basis for the urban areas and on an annual basis for the rural areas. The next important report is a payroll reporting, which is once again published by the National Statistical Office. See, whenever the workers join the formal sector of the Indian economy, these workers are entitled to get various social security benefits, which include the provident fund, insurance, pension, etc. So they get enrolled in various social security schemes of the government. So based upon how many workers are getting enrolled in these social security schemes, we then try to find out the extent of the formal employment creation in the Indian economy. So the payroll reporting data gives us the details of only the formal employment creation. It does not give us the details about the informal jobs. The next is the quarterly employment survey. Now this quarterly employment survey is published by the Labor Bureau, which works under the Ministry of Labor. And please do note that this particular survey report gives us the details of employment in only certain selected non-farm industrial sectors. So one of the basic problem with this particular report is it does not measure the employment in the agriculture sector. Apart from the agriculture sector, it takes into account certain selected industrial sectors, and in those selected industrial sectors, it measures the extent of employment. So as you can see, out of these three reports, the most comprehensive report to measure the extent of employment and unemployment happens to be the PLFS report. So in case of India, the enterprises as such are categorized into either the organized sector or the unorganized sector. Similarly, the workers are categorized into formal and informal workers. Now this particular categorization of the enterprises and the workers, it is based upon the definition provided by the National Commission on Enterprises for the Unorganized Sector. According to this particular commission, if a particular enterprise is registered with the Government of India and if it employs 10 or more workers, then such an enterprise would be considered to be part of the organized sector. On the other hand, if an enterprise remains unregistered and if it employs less than 10 workers, then it is considered to be part of the unorganized sector. So basically, the enterprises which come under the regulatory purview of the Government of India can be considered to be part of the organized sector, whereas the enterprises that do not come under the regulatory purview of the government, they can be considered to be part of the unorganized sector. Take for instance agriculture, household enterprises, micro enterprises, etc., which are not registered with the government. All such enterprises can be considered to be part of the unorganized sector. Similarly, the workers can be categorized into formal and informal workers. Informal workers are basically those workers who do not enjoy employment security. That means they are not permanent workers and they can be fired by the employees at any time. So basically they are a kind of contractual workers. They do not enjoy the work security, which means they are not entitled to get compensation in event of accidents while they are working, and they are also not entitled to get any kind of social security benefits. So all such workers can be categorized as the informal workers. On the other hand, if the workers enjoy the job security, work security and social security benefits, then we can consider such workers to be the formal workers. Since the last 7 to 8 years, the share of employment in the organized sector has increased, and this particular increase has been accompanied by a commensurate decrease in the share of employment in the unorganized sector. But even today, it is the unorganized sector that provides employment to almost around 81% of India's workforce, and only 19% of India's workforce is employed in the organized sector. Even within the organized sector, we will come across two categories of workers, that is the formal workers and the informal workers. So as discussed before, some of the enterprises may decide to hire the contractual workers. Some workers may not be hired on a permanent basis. Some workers may not have the work security, social security, etc. And all such workers will be considered as the informal workers. So as you can see, within the organized sector, the informal workers account for almost 51%. Whereas the share of the formal workers in the organized sector is the remaining 49%. Within the unorganized sector, it is basically the informal workers which dominate. So they account for almost around more than 99% of the share, and hardly like 0.7% of the overall share is that of the formal workers. Apart from that, if you look at the status of the India's workforce, even today, 90% of India's workforce is considered as the informal workforce, and only 10% of India's workforce is considered to be part of the formal workforce. But a good thing which has happened in the last 7 to 8 years is the share of the formal workers has increased from 8% to 10%. So slowly the Indian economy is witnessing the formalization of India's workforce. Now this is a good thing because, as you know, the formal workers are entitled to get the employment security, work security, social security benefits, and hence this is a step in the right direction. Lastly, let us have a look at the important highlights of the Periodic Labour Force Survey report for the year 2019-20. please concentrate on the last three rows here. So here we are looking at the periodic labor force survey report for the three financial years of 2017-18, 2018-19 and 2019-20. In particular, focus on the last row here. As you can see here, the labor force participation rate in terms of the current weekly status, this has increased from 36.2 to 38.3. Similarly, in terms of usual status also, the labor force participation rate has increased from 37.5 to 40.1. Now, the labor force participation rate has undoubtedly increased both in terms of usual status as well as the current weekly status. But the question is why? We are talking about the increase in the labor force participation rate, particularly when the GDP was facing the economic slowdown. See, because of the economic slowdown, the household's income levels have got reduced. And because of the decrease in the household income levels, some of the family members now might be compelled to work. They might be now compelled to search for work, and that is why the labor force participation rate may have increased. In particular, please do focus upon the labor force participation rate of the females. Earlier, it was 16.4 and now it has jumped to 20. This is in terms of current weekly status. Similarly, it has jumped even in terms of the usual status. So what does this mean? This means that more number of females are now looking out for work, basically in order to supplement their household incomes. So since the household income levels have dropped, now the females are trying to search for work in order to increase the overall income levels. So this is what we can understand with respect to the latest PLFS report. Further, at the start of our discussion, as I said, the labor force participation rate can be measured for the different age groups. At all India level, the labor force participation rate is around 40. But if you take into account only the working age group, the labor force participation rate is around 53. See, there is no need for you to remember all of these facts and figures. On a broad level, if you just understand the overall trends, that alone should be sufficient. Let us now solve the practice question. Now the practice question number 2 here is, with reference to the female labor force participation rate, consider the following statements. The female labor force participation rate has increased in the last 2 decades due to the creation of gender neutral job opportunities. See, this particular bar graph here has been taken from the Economic Survey 2019-20, and as you can see, the female labor force participation rate has reduced from 45% in 1993-94 to 25% in the year 2017-18. So the overall female labor force participation rate has decreased. That is why the statement which is given here is wrong. The second statement says that the female labor force participation rate in the urban areas is higher than that in the rural areas. Now, if you look at this particular bar graph here, clearly you can see that in case of the rural areas, the female labor force participation rate is 26.6, whereas in case of urban areas, it is 22.3. So the statement which is given here is wrong. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be D, neither 1 nor 2. As far as practice question number 3 and 4 is concerned, please attempt these questions on your own and let me know the answer in the comments section. Now coming to last practice question, the question here is, with reference to employment elasticity, consider the following statements. The employment elasticity measures the percentage change in the employment for every 1% increase in the GDP. The statement which is given here is right. So basically, if my GDP increases by 1% and if my employment growth rate also increases by 1%, it would mean that my employment elasticity is equal to 1. So basically, the employment elasticity measures the responsiveness of the employment growth in response to the GDP growth. The second statement reads as, the employment elasticity can never be negative. Now the statement which is given here is wrong. It may so happen that the GDP growth rate may increase by 1%, but rather than creating employment opportunities, this can lead to destruction of jobs. The employment can actually reduce by minus 1%. This can actually happen. In fact, such a scenario has been witnessed in India's manufacturing sector. So, the employment elasticity in some of the cases can actually be negative. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be A, that is 1 only. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article is titled as a bill to stop the strikes at the ordnance factories. See, recently the government has introduced the Essential Defense Services Bill before the Indian Parliament. This particular bill basically seeks to prohibit strikes and lockouts in the defense ordnance factories. So let us first understand the background to this particular issue. See, the defense production in case of India takes place in both the defense PSUs as well as the ordnance factories. So you have the defense PSUs such as the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, Bharat Electronics Limited, BEML and so on. See, these defense PSUs, they are actually registered as companies. So being companies, they are not directly managed by the government of India. For day-to-day management of these defense PSUs, we do have a board of directors who have the necessary professional as well as technical expertise. So the government of India as such is not directly involved in the management of these defense PSUs. So there is no micromanagement of the government. The role of the government in these defense PSUs is limited to laying down the broad targets. The day-to-day decision making is actually done by the board of directors. So in a way, you can consider that these defense PSUs enjoy substantial amount of independence and autonomy. There is less amount of political interference in the working of these defense PSUs. On the other hand, if you look at the Ordnance Factory Board, the Ordnance Factory Board is considered to be one of the oldest as well as the largest industrial setup involved in the defense production. We have almost around 41 ordnance factories which are spread across India, and these ordnance factories are involved in the production of arms, ammunition, tanks, missiles and so on. The Ordnance Factory Board functions under the direct control of the Department of Defense Production. So just like how railways in case of India functions directly under the control of government, the Ordnance Factory Board also functions directly under the control of the government. Which means to say here, there is lack of independence, lack of autonomy in the defense production. So each and every decision would have to be taken by the government of India, because of which there is huge amount of bureaucratic delays as well as red tapeism. Here, these industries as such are not having the necessary independence as well as autonomy. Similarly, the overall efficiency of the Ordnance Factory Board is also quite lower. For example, these ordnance factories have been prohibited from entering into agreements with the private sector entities for technological collaboration or to say increase their overall efficiency, because of which the overall quality of defense products which are manufactured by these ordnance factories, they are considered to be of poor quality. Not just that, there is huge amount of delay in the delivery of the defense products or the goods by these ordnance factories. Now, for example, whenever the defense forces need certain arms, ammunition, etc., they place orders before the ordnance factories, and these ordnance factories normally are unable to deliver the order on time. Apart from that, the overall capacity of these ordnance factories to innovate and perform efficiently is also lower because of the low technological adoption. So even though we have a large number of ordnance factories, we are so far failed to promote Atmanirbhar in the defense manufacturing. As you know, India is considered to be one of the world's largest arms importer, accounting for almost around 12% of the import of the world's arms. So obviously there is a need to boost the domestic manufacturing. There is a need to modernize the Ordnance Factory Board. We need to improve the overall efficiency of the Ordnance Factory Board. Accordingly, a number of committees in past, such as the Nair Committee, Kelkar Committee on Defense Modernization, etc., these committees had put forward a proposal that we need to corporatize the Ordnance Factory Board. See, the corporatization of the Ordnance Factory Board basically means that these Ordnance Factory Boards should function on the lines similar to the defense PSUs such as say HAL, BEL, etc. So these ordnance factories should have the necessary independence and autonomy. They should be professionally managed by the board of directors. These board of directors should have professional expertise, technical expertise. So the idea here is to improve the overall efficiency of the ordnance factory board and to ensure that these ordnance factories are at forefront of the technological adoption. Accordingly, based upon the recommendations of these committees, recently in the year 2020, the government had decided to corporatize the Ordnance Factory Board. In fact, the Union Cabinet has already given its proposal. According to the proposal which has been cleared by the Union Cabinet, the idea here is to merge all the ordnance factories, that is the 41 ordnance factories, into 7 large size 100% government owned PSUs, which means that in future all of these ordnance factories will be converted into the government owned PSUs, just like how we have HAL, BEL, etc. Further, we will consolidate these 41 ordnance factories into 7 large size government owned PSUs. So this is a proposal which has been approved by the Union Cabinet. Now the problem which has arisen here right now after this particular proposal is, see, presently these ordnance factories, the 41 ordnance factories, employ approximately around 81,000 employees. Now these employees are skeptical. They are apprehensive that this particular corporatization of Ordnance Factory Board would probably take them towards a privatization. These people are also apprehensive that if the government starts carrying out the restructuring of the employees, then some of the employees may lose out on their jobs. So basically there is a fear among the unions in these ordnance factories, and these unions have recently decided to declare indefinite strike against this particular government move. They have decided that this indefinite strike would start from July 26. Now just imagine if all the workers unions in these ordnance factories go on an indefinite strike. Obviously this will compromise our national security. Obviously in that particular case the ordnance factories will no longer be in a position to cater to our defense requirements. And such a development particularly comes at a time wherein India is involved in a border dispute with China. So obviously here we need to ensure that the ordnance factories are able to function at their optimum level. We need to ensure that the ordnance factories are able to cater to the needs of our defense forces. Accordingly, on June 30th, 2021, the President had promulgated the Essential Defense Services Ordinance. So now the Government of India has introduced the Essential Defense Services Bill to replace the earlier ordinance which was promulgated by the Indian President. And as highlighted before, this particular bill basically seeks to prohibit strikes and lockouts in the ordnance factories. So the idea here is to ensure that the ordnance factories would keep on functioning. See, the Essential Defense Services Bill has so far not been passed by the Indian Parliament. That is why I will not be discussing the provisions of this particular bill. However, in order to provide you more amount of clarity with respect to this particular bill, the provisions of this particular bill have been incorporated in the PDF for your reference. I hope you will be able to read the provisions of the bill and understand on your own. My idea of this particular discussion was to give you the background or the insights as to why this particular bill has been introduced. The next article is related to the monkey bee virus. See, the global community is already grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. Amidst this particular gloom, China has recently reported its first human death on account of the monkey bee virus. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of science and technology. This article is quite important because, as you can see in the previous year prelims, questions have been asked with respect to the outbreak of viral diseases. In prelims 2017, a question has been asked with respect to Zika virus, and in prelims 2015, two questions, one question related to the Ebola virus and another question related to the H1N1 virus. See, if you have a look at the previous year prelims question, basically you need to understand as to how do these viral diseases get transmitted, whether human to human transmission of these diseases, is it possible? So if you understand these basic aspects related to monkey bee virus, that alone would be sufficient. There is no need to get into detailed aspects. See, the monkey bee virus belongs to a family of virus known as the alpha herpes virus. The alpha herpes virus are basically those kind of virus that affects the nervous system of their host. The monkey bee virus is predominantly found in macaque monkeys, chimpanzees, etc. See, when the macaque monkeys get infected with the monkey bee virus, these macaque monkeys, they may not develop any symptoms. And in some of the cases, this could actually emerge as only a mild disease. But the same monkey bee virus, when it affects the chimpanzees, chimpanzees may actually die. The monkey bee virus is also referred to as the herpes bee virus. As far as the transmission of this particular virus is concerned, the monkey bee virus is found in saliva, urine, brain, or the spinal cord tissues of the monkeys who have been infected with the monkey bee virus. So, if a monkey which has been infected with the monkey bee virus either bites or scratches a human being, then such a human being can be infected with the monkey bee virus. But we all know that across the world, a large number of people get bitten or get scratched by the monkeys. And in some of these cases, these monkeys may be infected with the monkey bee virus. In spite of that, the infection of monkey bee virus in human beings, it is extremely rare. For example, the first instance of the monkey bee virus was actually recorded way back in 1932. So far, till now, we have been able to document only 50 people who have been infected due to the monkey bee virus. And out of these 50 people, 21 people have died since then. So the probability of people being infected with the monkey bee virus is quite lower. But at the same time, you must realize that the people who are working in the medical field, such as say healthcare workers, lab workers, these people face a higher threat of being infected with the monkey bee virus. As far as the human to human transmission is concerned, see, the human to human transmission is obviously possible, but so far we have recorded only one case of one human being infecting another human being. So this is once again quite rare. As far as symptoms of the monkey bee virus is concerned, initially the symptoms start developing as a flu-like symptoms wherein a person starts getting fever, muscle ache, fatigue, headache, etc. And as the disease progresses, the virus can spread across the body and it can cause the inflammation of brain and spinal cord. As of now, there is no treatment available against the monkey bee virus, and we also do not have any vaccines. So if you know these aspects related to monkey bee virus, that alone would be sufficient from the perspective of the prelims examination. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article is related to the Great Indian Bustard. This article shall be important from the perspective of environment and biodiversity. See, during 1960s, when India was choosing as to which bird should become its national bird, that time one of the top contenders was the Great Indian Bustard. But eventually it lost the race to Indian peacock. Now, if you look at the status of the Great Indian Bustard, its overall population has got reduced by 90% in the last 50 years. As you can see, in 1969 we used to have approximately around 1260 bustards, and now by the end of 2020 the overall population of Indian bustards has got reduced to less than 150. In particular, recently the government has informed the Rajya Sabha that as on 1st of Jan this year, we do not have Great Indian bustards in the Kutch Bustard Sanctuary. Now, why it becomes important is, it was in this particular sanctuary that the overall population of the Great Indian Bustard had increased in the past. But now, we have lost all of the Great Indian Bustards in this particular sanctuary. So let us try to understand some details about the Great Indian Bustard, in particular as to what factors have led to the decline in the population. Just like with other animal species, one of the main reasons for the decline in the population of Great Indian Bustard has been attributed to the loss of their habitats. This is once again because of rapid urbanization, because of expansion of agriculture related activities, infrastructure development, and so on. More importantly, if you look at the Great Indian Bustards, they are actually large in size. Being large in size, they normally take low flights, and because of the low flights, they frequently collide with the overhead transmission lines. Apart from the collision with the overhead transmission lines, the Great Indian Bustards also collide with the windmills. So because of the frequent collision with the overhead power lines as well as windmills, their overall population has been reducing. So in order to prevent the death of the great Indian bustards, right now the Supreme Court is examining as to whether these overhead transmission lines can they be replaced by the underground power cables. Apart from that, recently the Supreme Court has issued the directions to the government of Rajasthan as well as Gujarat in order to install the bird diverters and to prevent their frequent deaths. Other reasons for the decline in the population include the stray dogs, which are known to frequently attack the bustards' eggs as well as the young ones. Further, poaching of the Indian bustards also take place, particularly outside their protected area. As far as the distribution of Great Indian Bustard is concerned, earlier the Great Indian Bustards were widely spread across both India as well as Pakistan, but right now their population is confined to only some of the states in India. These include Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, etc. So as you can see here, they are predominantly found in the Kutch district of Rajasthan, Solapur and Chandrapur district of Maharashtra, Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh, Bellary district of Karnataka, and in certain pockets of Rajasthan, particularly in the Desert National Park. So due to their rapid decline in the population, they have been categorized as a critically endangered species under the IUCN. Hence, in order to protect the great Indian bustards, the government of India has declared certain protected areas. The first one is the Desert National Park, which is spread across the two districts of Rajasthan, that is Jaisalmer and Balmer. The next is the Kutch Bird Sanctuary, which is also referred to as the Nalia Sanctuary. In Madhya Pradesh, Karera Wildlife Sanctuary. However, according to reports since 1990s, we have not come across the population of the great Indian bustards in the Karera Wildlife Sanctuary. Then the Nanaj Grasslands in Solapur in Maharashtra, Rollapadu Wildlife Sanctuary in the state of Andhra Pradesh. So as far as the conservation status is concerned, they have been listed under the first schedule of the Indian Wildlife Protection Act 1972. So they have been given the highest level of protection. The Great Indian Bustard has also been listed in the Appendix 1 of the CITES Convention. Further, presently the government is implementing the integrated development of the wildlife habitat scheme. One of the components of this particular scheme is the species recovery program. So the Great Indian Bustard has been identified as one of the species which has to be recovered. And lastly, the Great Indian Bustard has been declared as the state bird of Rajasthan. So these are some of the important aspects about the Great Indian Bustard which you need to know from the perspective of the prelims examination.